We're going to start questions to the Prime Minister. I will call the Prime Minister to answer the engagements question. I will then call Mr Lawrence Robertson to ask his supplementary. Prime Minister.
Good morning, Mr Speaker. I hope very much our connection works today. This is my last day of virtual meetings with ministerial colleagues and others before I come out of isolation. In addition to my virtual meetings and duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
We're now going across to Lawrence Robertson in Tewkesbury. Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can the Prime Minister guarantee that in any agreement he reaches with the European Union, that British sovereignty will be protected for the whole of the United Kingdom and that the UK will exit the transitional period on the 31st of December as a whole?
Prime Minister.
Yes, indeed. I can make that guarantee, Mr Speaker, and our position on fish hasn't changed. We'll only be able to make progress if the EU accepts the reality that we must be able to control access to our waters. And it's very important at this stage to emphasise that point.
The Leader of the Opposition, the Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Today is International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls. On average, a woman is killed by a man every 3 days in this country. It's a shocking statistic. And sadly, the pandemic has seen a significant increase in domestic abuse. I'll join those marking this day, and I'm sure the whole House would agree we need to do far more to end domestic violence. Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister may remember that in August of last year, he wrote the foreword to the Ministerial Code. It says, and I quote, "There must be no bullying, no harassment, no leaking, no misuse of taxpayers' money, no actual or perceived conflicts of interest." That's 5 promises in 2 sentences. How many of those promises does the Prime Minister think his ministers have kept?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr Speaker, I believe that the ministers of this government are working hard and overall doing an outstanding job in delivering the people's priorities, and that's what we will continue to do. And I think if he waits a little bit longer today, he'll hear some of the ways in which this government is going to be taking this country forward with one of the most ambitious programmes of investment in infrastructure, in our schools, our hospitals, for generations. And if he wants to make any particular allegations about individual ministers or their conduct, then he's welcome to do so. And the floor is his.
Keir Starmer.
Mr Speaker, I didn't really hear an answer there. So why don't we go through these commitments in turn, starting with bullying and harassment. The now former independent adviser on ministerial standards concluded that the Home Secretary's behaviour was, in his words, in breach of the ministerial code, and he said can be described as bullying, which, Mr Speaker, means intimidating or insulting behaviour that makes an individual feel uncomfortable, frightened, less respected or put down. What message does the Prime Minister think it sends that the independent adviser on standards has resigned, but the Home Secretary is still in post?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, the Home Secretary, Sir Alex's decisions are entirely a matter for him, but the Home Secretary has apologised for any way in which her conduct fell short. And frankly, Mr Speaker, I make no apology for sticking up, for standing by a Home Secretary who, as I said just now, is getting on with delivering on the people's priorities, putting already 6,000 of the 20,000 more police out on the street to fight crime, instituting in the teeth of very considerable resistance a new Australian-style points-based immigration system. She's getting on with delivering what I think the people of this country want. She's showing a steely determination, and I think that's probably why his side continue to bash her.
Keir Starmer.
Mr Speaker, the reality is that any other Prime Minister would have fired the Home Secretary, and any other Home Secretary would have resigned. So I think we'll chalk that up as one broken promise. On to the next. No leaking. Over the summer, we saw repeated leaks about which areas would go into restrictions. The Prime Minister's plans to go into a second national lockdown were leaked all over the national papers, resulting in a truly chaotic press conference. And we've seen more leaking in the last 24 hours. This serial leaking is causing huge anxiety to millions of people about what's going to happen next. Now, I know there's supposed to be an inquiry underway, but can the Prime Minister tell us, is he any closer to working out who in his government is leaking this vital information?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I've already told you that as soon as we have any information about anybody leaking, we'll bring it to the House. But I may say, I think the right honourable gentleman is really concentrating on trivia, when what the people of this country want is to see his support and the support of politicians across the House for the tough measures that we're putting in to defeat coronavirus. He makes various attacks on, I think, on my leadership and the handling of the ministerial code. I take them a lot more seriously, frankly, Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition could explain whether or why the right honourable gentleman, the member for Islington North, is still a member of the Labour Party. Does he support the right honourable member for Islington North continued membership of the Labour Party? Yes or no? Why doesn't he answer that question?
I think I'll just answer the fact that it actually is Prime Minister's questions, not Leader of the Opposition questions. Keir Starmer.
Reasonable question, Mr. Speaker.
I think I'll make that decision, Prime Minister. And I think, thankfully, we've got the song. We don't want to lose it. Keir Starmer.
It was your end last time, by the way.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The difference, of course, is that I'm tackling the issues in my party. He's running away from the issues in his. And I take it from his answer. I take it from his answer that he's no idea who's leaking from his government. So I think we put that's another one in the no column. Moving on. Perhaps the most serious of the promises under the Code. No misuse of taxpayers' money. For weeks, I've raised concern about the government's spraying taxpayers' money on contracts that don't deliver. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is even worse than we thought. This week, a Cabinet Office response suggests that the government purchased not 50 million unusable items of protective equipment, but 180 million. And a new report this morning by the National Audit Office identifies a further set of orders totalling £214 million for face masks for the NHS that it can't use. So will the Prime Minister come clean? How many hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money has been wasted on equipment that can't be used?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, actually 99.5%, to answer his question directly, 99.5% of the PPE, the 32 billion items of PPE that this country has secured, conformed entirely to our clinical needs once we checked it. And I think of all the lines of attack, the pathetic lines of attack that we've heard so far, this is the feeblest. Because if you remember, Mr. Speaker, we were faced with a national pandemic that on a scale that we hadn't seen before, and the government was being attacked by the Labour Party for not moving fast enough to secure PPE. I remember the right honourable gentleman saying that we needed to unblock the blockages in the system and that we needed to shift heaven and earth to get it done. That's what he said at the beginning of the pandemic. Then he complained that we moved too slow. Now he's saying that we moved too fast. He's got to make up his mind what his attack is.
Keir Starmer.
Well, it's obvious that either the Prime Minister doesn't know how much taxpayers' money has been wasted, or he doesn't care. So far, Mr. Speaker, that's bullying, harassment, leaking and misuse of taxpayers' money. I must say, Prime Minister, it's not looking good so far, so let's press on. The next one is no actual or perceived conflicts of interest. Where do I start on this one, Mr. Speaker? Last week, we learned that suppliers with political connections were 10 times more likely to be awarded government contracts. This week, the Sunday Times reports that the Health Secretary appointed one of his closest friends to a key advisory role. This friend also is a major shareholder, as it happens, in a firm that specialises in lobbying the government on behalf of its clients, and some of those clients have secured tens of millions of pounds of government contracts during the pandemic. Was the Prime Minister aware of this apparent conflict of interest?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, insofar as there are any conflicts of interest, they will be evident from the publication of all the details of all the contracts. And again, he just seems to be attacking the government for shifting heaven and earth, as we did, to get the medicines, to get the PPE, to get the equipment, to get the treatments that this country needed. And what it reveals, really, is a deep underlying Labour hatred of the private sector. And it's actually thanks to the private sector and government working with the private sector that the UK was able to produce the world's first usable treatment for the disease in dexamethasone, the world's first, and has worked hard to secure huge numbers of doses of the world's first usable room temperature vaccine. That's the private sector working to deliver for the people of this country. And it's common sense, conservative government working with the private sector rather than abominating them and relying exclusively on some deranged form of state control. How else does he think we could possibly have done it?
Keir Starmer.
No one's knocking the private sector. The government's knocking the taxpayer. And that's not trivial. So, Mr. Speaker, I think it's a clean sweep. Bullying, harassment, leaking, wasting public money and obvious conflicts of interest. It's the same old story. One rule for the British public, another for the Prime Minister and his friends. Just look at the contrast between his attitude to spraying public money at contracts that don't deliver and his attitude to pay rises for the key workers who kept the country going during this pandemic. If you've got a hotline to ministers, you get a blank cheque. But if you're on the front line tackling COVID, you're picking up the bill. So will the Prime Minister finally get his priorities right, stop wasting taxpayers' money and give police officers, firefighters, care workers and other key workers the pay rise they so obviously deserve?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's this party and this government that has given key workers, public sector workers, above inflation pay rises this year, as he knows, for police, for the army, for nurses are now getting 12.6% more than they were 3 years ago. And it is this government that will continue to increase the living wage, as he will discover if you just contain his impatience just for a few minutes. Indeed, it's this government that has not only delivered free school meals and fast increase in spending on development around the world, but has looked after the poorest and the neediest. And one of the most important facts about the coronavirus package, the £200 billion package of support that the Chancellor has devised for lives and livelihoods across the country, is that the benefits for overwhelmingly prioritise the poorest and neediest in the country. And the reason we can do that is because we have a government that understands how to run a strong economy and to makes sure that it takes the tough decisions now that will allow our economy to bounce back. And that's what this government is doing.
Laura Trott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the promised increase in